morning and welcome to this special board meeting of the Akron Public Schools on Saturday, March 2nd, 2024. For those of you who are joining us this early Saturday morning, thank you. Thank you to my colleagues. Roll call, please. Dr. Thompson.
Mr. Alexander.
Present.
Ms. Autry.
Present.
Mr. Perry.
I'm here.
Dr. Molnar.
Present.
Mrs. Sykes.
Present.
5 present, 2 absent.
Thank you. And if you are able to stand, please. Mr. Alexander, could you please lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you very much. And so we're going to jump right on into this training session. Again, thank you to my colleagues for being here this morning and your commitment for us being the best version of ourselves as a board. And so I'd like to take this time and welcome our presenter for professional development today, Mr. Mark Jackson, Esquire from Pebble and Wagner. Thank you, Mr. Jackson, for joining us.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I believe I've got my microphone on and everything. Good morning. Through the board chair, board president, to the board and the administration, I appreciate you having me this morning. We're going to present on Robert's Rules of Procedure, how Ohio's Open Meetings Act relates among Robert's rules, and then some principles of boardsmanship. I'm Mark Jackson. I'm an attorney with Pebble and Wagner. Our offices are based out of the Cleveland area. I serve as legal counsel for the Educational Service Center of Northeast Ohio. They were kind enough to connect me with the board here to put this presentation together. So I have prepared some materials. They are in your packet. It's about a 50-page outline. We have another session that we've also already arranged if that time's needed. I've done this presentation a handful of times. It can run anywhere from 2 hours to 4 hours, depending on interactions, or if you want me to just handle the presentation myself, I can get through it quicker. But my time's your time, so if there are questions throughout, feel free to bring things up. We can talk through some items if I need to clarify things. I'm here for the board's pleasure, so we can get through these things as well. I'll be working from this outline. We're going to go through it step by step. The first portion is primarily on Robert's Rules of Order. If there are items in Ohio law that supersede what the Robert's Rules would require, then we'll also highlight those as well. And then we'll turn to Open Meetings Act. So we're going to talk about how to actually proceed through a meeting with Robert's Rules, and then we'll talk about the Open Meetings Act, how that the requirements under Ohio law to make sure that meetings are being operated properly and that things are being recorded correctly. And then finally, we'll talk through some ethical considerations and some principles of boardmanship, how to work through meetings as well as with colleagues and everything. So that's what the basic overview of my presentation will be. We're going to start off, jump right in. This is on page 1, dealing with Robert's Rules of Order. So just as a general overview, the parliamentary procedures are generally accepted rules of order and practices commonly used by boards, commissions, and other deliberative assemblies to help the bodies as they govern. The rules are intended to maintain decorum, to determine the will of the majority, protect the rights of the minority, and facilitate the orderly transaction of business. So this is a statement from Ohio Schools Boards Association. They also provide some input on Robert's Rules of Procedure. So if there are questions, you can always go through OSBA. They can help you out as well, or legal counsel. And another aspect of this is Robert's Rules are generally designed to provide some structure to assemblies. So it could be any public body. It could be any corporation. It just gives you some guidelines to work through to make things efficient, to allow the organization to operate, to allow people to that are on the board to provide their input for decision-making processes, and also how those decisions are made. Boards of education typically adopt parliamentary procedure as set forth in Robert's Rules of Order. They are the most common used to provide a systematic structure for the board's meeting and to make meetings more efficient. Parliamentary procedure is not, so Robert's Rules of Order is not a law, it's not an administrative rule, it's set by policy that you're going to follow Robert's Rules of Order. It provides a consistent system for operating meetings. Violations of the procedure wouldn't really be subject to legal challenge unless there's instances where certain numbers of votes have to occur in certain times, either set by law or set by the rules. Those would be the things that, if there is a potential challenge, that would occur. But ultimately, the Akron School Board or any other school board is determining what parliamentary procedure they're going to follow. If you've adopted Robert's rules as this board has, then we like to maintain that structure to make sure that those are being followed. It's something that's important, but also it's not a law that is required under Ohio Revised Code. Rules of parliamentary procedure were not written specifically for school boards, so since this is other entities in mind as well, there are some items in those rules that may not be applicable to a Board of Education, and maybe are intended for larger bodies. Some shareholders meetings, they would use Robert's Rules of Order. You'd have hundreds of people in a room. There are different ways that those would be handled. Standing, for instance, how acknowledgement from the board chair would occur. Those types of items in a larger body may, it may be something more intended for those. If you read through the Robert's Rules of Order, I mean, it's 1,000 pages. It's not a difficult read because the font's pretty big, but ultimately, the guidebook also is something that's a good resource. There are times when specific procedural matters are governed by Ohio law or board policy where the board would not follow Robert's rules. Boards must make sure they are following the law or policy if there's a conflict with those parliamentary rules. So if we got a parliamentary rule and a law that says something different, for instance, if a 2/3 vote's required under Ohio law, we want to make sure we follow the 2/3 majority vote rather than having just a strict majority in Robert's rules. Other potentially applicable laws are the Ohio Open Meetings Act. So the Meetings Act dictates some items, how to go into executive session, when roll call vote is required in certain instances. Those types of items, we would want to follow the Open Meetings Act over the parliamentary procedure. Laws applicable to the boards of education that require specific voting majorities, we already referenced that. In your board policy, there's a board policy 0167. It's attached at one of the last 3 pages of your outline. So you have in your board policy certain references to Ohio statutory code that says, here's when a majority of the votes required, here's when a 2/3 vote's required, here's when a 2/3 votes of the entire board is required versus 2/3 vote of those that are present. So those items are in your board policy. There's statutory references to the Ohio Revised Code in there. So if we need to fall back to look at something, go look at that portion of your board policy. I've also appended an attachment 2, which is the last page of your outline, and this is guidance from the Ohio School Boards Association on basically motions. Incidental motions, which we're going to all go over all these, privilege motions, subsidiary motions, when a debate is needed, when no debate is needed, when the majority vote is needed to pass a motion or a subsidiary motion or privilege motion, or when no vote's required, is it amendable, is it required, is a second required? There's certain items that don't require a second, there's certain items that don't require a majority vote. There's some that require a 2/3 vote. So those items we're going to go through the outline. But this is another cheat sheet that's available to you to take a look at. If you need a quick reference to figure out how the board should proceed. A board member may demand that the treasurer call a roll call vote and record the names of those voting in favor or against a motion with regard to any motion or resolution before the board. So if there are items, so this is specifically under Ohio law, if you don't use roll call vote on every one of your votes, a lot of boards of education do because they don't want to hit the pitfall of, we didn't use a roll call when we should have. So that's kind of up to the discretion of the board whether they use voice vote, roll call vote, but there are items where roll call is required, and if there's instances where a board member would like to have a roll call vote so everybody has their specific vote on the record, then any board member can demand a roll call vote for any vote or all votes. So board policy 0161, that's what sets Robert's Rule of Order as the procedural rules that are going to be applied by the Akron Board of Education. As I said, there are other options. There's Atwood's rules, democratic rules of order. There are other options besides Robert's rules. Robert's rule is by far the most common, but the board makes that decision and would set it by policy if they want to change it. Unless otherwise stated, so in this outline, I've referenced the 12th edition of Robert's Rule of Order. That's the most recent edition. It was published about 3 or 4 years ago. Before that, there's been various other editions, but the one that's seen as most authoritative is the current one would be the 12th edition. So if you have a copy of that, there are electronic copies available online as well if you don't have a copy. So first order that we're going to talk about is just the governing body and its members. Some of the items that we will talk about somewhat overlap or could be put in a different portion of the outline. So bear with me. We're going to go through this as, I guess, systematically as we can. But again, there will be some references to back and forth between the outline. So Ohio's public school system, as you're aware, is divided into school districts. The governing body of a school district is its Board of Education. So it makes the decisions on behalf of the board, on behalf of the school district. It's composed of members elected by the individuals that live within the school district. Each Board of Education has authority to govern the schools in the district which is authorized. Some boards of education have 5 members. This one has 7. Joint vocational school districts as well have a larger board than your normal 5. So when we're looking at majority vote or 2/3 vote, there's a difference between a board that would have 5 total members to reach that threshold of 2/3 versus a board of 7 to reach that majority threshold of 2/3 in instances when that's required. The bylaws of a governing body are the documents that contain its basic rules relating principally to itself as an organization rather than to the parliamentary procedure that it follows, although the bylaws may identify the parliamentary procedure. So in your board policies, the first portion of it, your board policies are, I guess, divided up into about 10 different areas. Your bylaws are that first area that governs the operations. That's your bylaws that set forth how the Board of Education intends to operate. The term rules of order refers to those written rules of parliamentary procedure formally adopted by the governing board. Those rules relate to the orderly transaction of business in meetings and to the duties of the officers in those meetings as well as the interactions of board members within a meeting. So that's, again, why we've adopted Robert's rules. That's why we follow what we're going to go over today. Turning next to decorum of members. How should members interact with each other? How should they treat each other? Primarily, this is designed to discuss how members should address each other in meetings, how meetings should flow in a public setting. Obviously, in personal settings, it's a little bit differently. But again, taking those professionalism items from the decorum set forth in Robert's rules certainly would be beneficial as well if you just use that in your day-to-day interactions with each other. Ultimately, the president is responsible, so your board president is responsible for presiding over the meeting using an objective and impersonal approach to maintain order and should endeavor to remain impartial when serious divisions arise. So the board president is designated with the task of serving a dual purpose. In boards of education, all your board members are board members. They have all the same rights and abilities as a member. But the board president sits in in another type of position where it's almost an intermediary or someone that has to stand a little bit above the board, above the fray. So if there's contention that's going on in between the board meeting, the board president is designated with the one that's trying to keep some impartiality. So if somebody needs to speak, the board president would recognize that person. if there's an opposing viewpoint, make sure the other person has their opportunity to speak as well. And the board president kind of manages that rather than just providing their input one way or the other. There's a little bit of impartiality and decorum. That being said, a board president, since that board president is also a member of the board president also has the ability to express the opinion of the board president to the membership as well. So it's somewhat of a dual purpose role that the board president sits in. And we're going to go into that in more detail when we talk about actual offices in the Board of Education. To maintain decorum, Robert's rules advise members to only address the board president and then address each other through the chair. So this is a traditional way that communications occur in board meetings. Normally, if you want to speak, the board member would obtain the attention of the board president. The board president would then recognize the individual to speak rather than going across the table back and forth to discuss something. So we'll talk about it, the logistics of this in a little bit, but for the most part, items are addressed or information is addressed through the chair or through the board president rather than directly to another board member. Members are advised not to speak first without having obtained the floor as recognized by the president. To claim the floor, a board member obtains the attention of the president when no one else has the floor. It says, Mr. President, Madam President. In this instance, if the member is entitled to the floor at the time, the board president recognizes the member, typically by announcing that person's name or last name, so Mr., Mrs., Dr., and their last name. This member then has the floor and has been provided the opportunity to speak at the time. When the member is finished speaking, the member yields the floor and the board president may recognize somebody else to speak at that point. So somebody interrupting somebody else is not viewed as proper under Robert's Rules of Procedure. If several members are attempting to claim the floor, this is one of those times where the board president steps in, decides who should have the floor to talk, and then provides the next individual down the line the ability to speak during once that first individual has had their opportunity to speak and say what they want to say. Members should be polite and professional, respectfully address the board president and not to each other. No member should interrupt another member while the member is speaking or has the floor. It is considered out of order to speak while another person has the floor. And we'll talk about what happens if somebody continues to be out of order. The board president normally takes that, that situation under control, rules somebody out of order, but we'll talk about the logistics of that later. Again, we've got some overlap in here, but so this is kind of an overview, and we'll get into the details of it at a future time. A board may adopt a rule on how long a member may speak before yielding to another, but is not required to have any rule. Oftentimes, there will be 2 minutes, 5 minutes, something set by the board, especially if you have somebody from the public coming, you have a limited amount of time, but when it comes to board members, that also can be set. When you have debate on an item, you can restrain the talking to 5 minutes for a board member or 2 minutes, depending on the issue that's up for discussion. But again, that's up to the board to make those decisions. And under Robert's Rules of Order, those should be enforced by the board president if something is set. We're now turning to page 4 of your outline. The board president is also tasked with ensuring that discussion remains on topic. So if there's items that somebody, you have your agenda, we have items on the agenda, the discussion of that item should be confined to that item. If somebody from the board is speaking, going on tangents that aren't about the item at issue is not recommended under Robert's Rules of Order, and the board president is allowed to bring to the attention of a member that they're not speaking on topic. So again, that's something that the board often will have its own way that it operates, but if we're talking about Robert's Rules of Order, when your agenda item comes up, the agenda item is the only thing for discussion at that time. If a board member believes that a procedural error occurred or a correction is needed, the member may bring this to the attention of the board president by raising a point of order to require enforcement of the regular rules. However, again, it's not courteous to be always raising a point of order. They should be used sparingly and to maintain decorum of the overall body. So if somebody does deviate from the standard procedures, sometimes we let that go. Other times we need to stay on task, and a point of order is necessary. So number 7 on this page sets forth how you would proceed with a point of order. It doesn't require a second. It's not debatable. However, with the board president's consent, a member may be permitted to explain the point, and being knowledgeable and interested members can be heard by way of explanation. So if you have somebody that requests a point of order, or the board president says point of order, stay on task, it's normally ruled upon solely by the board president unless the board president wants input on the matter. So if this is something that's really going off the rails, if it's going outside the bounds of what our discussion item is, then maybe the board president opens it up to the further body before making a ruling on a point of order. When the board president has made a ruling, any 2 members can appeal by making an incidental motion to appeal from the decision of the chair. So if the board president has enforced point of order, 2 board members can interject and say they appeal that decision. So if there's a disagreement on a ruling or decision, we normally refer to that as an appeal. It's not an objection. We're not in a court of law. We're calling it an appeal. So we would appeal that. Then any 2 members can make that appeal by making an incidental motion. And an appeal from the decision of the chair requires a second, so is debatable, and requires a majority vote. So ultimately, if there are 2 individuals that raise an appeal, we then require a second on that. Then it opens debate to the board as to whether that decision should be overruled, the board president's decision be overruled through a majority vote. In ordinary meetings, again, it's undesirable to raise points of order on minor irregularities or of purely technical character if it is clear that no one's rights are being infringed upon and no real harm is being done to the proper transaction of business. So again, there's also some decorum as well to not have infighting. The Board of Education, although we're making decisions as a whole, and there are going to be some times where decision-making may be contentious, it's also important to maintain that decorum throughout the procedure because you are one body, and the most consensus that you can have on a decision certainly helps in furthering the decisions of the Board of Education.
Mr. Jackson, I have
Certainly.
a question. So the chair can call a point of order?
Correct.
So who, is it just the chair's decision that they call it?
Yes. So the chair would call. So if somebody else, another one of these, another board member can say, everything goes through the board president. If somebody finds somebody else on task, raise a point of order to the board chair. The board chair then makes a decision on whether a point of order is going to be called or not. So ultimately, the initial decision is from the board president to make that decision on whether to call the point of order. But it can be raised by somebody in another one of the board members.
The chair can raise the point of
A chair can raise the point of order, or any of the other members can raise to the chair a point of order. So if somebody, if for instance another board member is going off topic and it's going lengthy, another board member can say, Madam Chair, Madam President, I'd like to raise a point of order. The board president then takes that, makes a decision on whether point of order should be called. So ordering the individual to be on task. And then if there's an objection from that, so an appeal.
So my question is,
Sure.
if the president or the chair calls it, then is it just
Then
done deal?
you've made the initial
I've
decision
made
on a
this-
point of order. Correct.
Okay.
Yes. So
And is timing also would fall under that?
So if somebody's exceeded an amount of time,
Yes.
certainly. Yep. The point of order is to get somebody on task or to bring them in alignment with what the Robert's rules say. So that is generally handled through the chair or by the chair. So I guess, is that any other questions on points of order?
So I think you were starting to talk about it, Mark. So if we disagree with what the chair says, we can appeal that? We can
Correct.
object to that?
So, for instance, if you disagree with the board chair's point of order, then you can say, I'd like to appeal. I'd like to submit an appeal. I'd like to appeal. I move to appeal. You would need a second. So there would need to be 2 board members that are willing to appeal that decision. It then goes to debate. So we're going to talk about debate and how that occurs. So the entire board debates over whether this point of order should be called or not, and then ultimately there is a vote, and by majority vote, whether that point of order should be, rescinded. Is what, for lack of a better term, rescinded, and the individual that had the point of order called on them, they could return to what tangential item they were talking about that brought up the point of order in the first place. Yes.
I have a question, and it's actually kind of a couple pages back, but since you mentioned rescinding, and the chart says rescinding is a 2/3 vote, can you please clarify for me the difference between a 2/3 vote and a majority vote on a 7-member board? Because the majority is 4, but 2/3 is like 4 point virtually.
Right, so you would round up, so it'd be 5.
So we would
yes.
have to round up. So
Yep.
to rescind, we would need 5.
You would need 5, right.
Thank you.
And we'll talk about rescission in more detail, almost too much detail, later in the materials, because there's both a ability to rescind. There's also an ability to rescind and expunge, which is kind of an extreme rescission. But we'll talk about those and what the purpose of them are as we proceed through the outline. Turning now to, since we're still on the topic of just board members overall, resignations of board members. So this is governed more by Ohio law than it is Robert's Rule. Robert's Rules does contain a procedure for a board member that wants to resign, but there is Ohio Attorney General guidance and when a resignation actually becomes effective. So if somebody wants to step down off the board, obviously there is also parts of Ohio law that, if you're no longer a resident of the district, then you are disqualified to be a board member, not necessarily a resignation. You're disqualified at that point. But this is resignation of a board member. The Ohio Attorney General is advised that the immediate and unconditional resignation of a board member is effective when submitted to the board and may not be withdrawn thereafter. However, there is a court case out there, and it's kind of recent, 2003. A court found that where a board member submitted a resignation to be effective on a future date, so my resignation is effective at the end of the month, and later rescinded the resignation rescinded that resignation prior to the effective date, and the remainder of the board had not voted to accept the resignation, the board member was able to validly withdraw that resignation and could remain on the board. So let's say you submit a resignation at the end of the month, the board hasn't met to accept the resignation. That board member says, changes their feelings on it. I'm going to rescind that resignation before the board has met to accept the resignation. Then that individual would still remain a board member according to this Strongsville decision. So that's up in Cuyahoga County. Obviously, there is another jurisdictional court. I don't know if the Court of Appeals here in Akron, in Summit County, would come up with the same decision, but there is this is at least some provisional guidance that's been cited by both the Attorney General and at least one court in Ohio. Next topic we're going to go into is the basics of a board meeting. So how do you open a meeting? How do you close a meeting? Those types of things, what may come up during a meeting. So the opening of the meeting is referred to as the call to order. When the time of the meeting has arrived and a quorum is present, the board president opens the meeting by calling the meeting to order. Ohio's Open Meetings Act sets the rules for the establishment of a quorum. So this is not necessarily what Robert's Rules says is a quorum. It's designated by Ohio law, Revised Code 12122, which is the Open Meetings Act. A majority of the members of the public body present in person constitutes a quorum for Ohio Open Meetings Act purposes, and then board policy as well, reflecting 3313-18, also establishes what a quorum is to be present to actually hold a meeting, to be considered a public meeting. In the absence of a quorum, any business transacted is null and void. So if you have 3 board members, they've all showed up, we've noticed the meeting properly and everything, those 3 board members can't just say, we're opening the meeting. We don't have a quorum here present. If you had the 4th member here, the meeting could be opened. If somebody arrives late, that 5th person could join into the meeting, but we can't have any actual business occur if we only have, if we don't have a majority of the board here, if we don't have a quorum, if we don't have 4 out of the 7 here, then we can't actually hold a valid public meeting. So any discussions, any actions that are taken, those would all be void because the full board, or a quorum of the board wasn't present. The board president, again, this is a task delegated to the board president. President has an obligation to determine that a quorum is present. When the board president has called a meeting to order after finding that a quorum is present, the continued presence of a quorum is presumed unless the board president or a member notices that a quorum is no longer present. If the board president notices the absence of a quorum, it is the president's duty to declare the fact and state for the record that the body has insufficient members present to continue the meeting and no further business should be conducted. So if we start the meeting with 4, somebody decides they're getting up, they're walking out, whatever it may be, we don't have a quorum there any longer. It's the board president's duty to put on the record, no quorum is present, we can no longer transact business. Even if that's somebody that stands up, walks out, goes to the restroom, we need to go into recess or stand at ease until that person comes back for us to proceed with the meeting. So make sure that we have a quorum present in the room, because Ohio Open Meetings Act says that quorum must be there for public business to occur. So if we're getting technical, we want to make sure we have 4 people there to make decisions, to deliberate, to take action on an item to move forward.
Mr. Jackson?
Certainly, yep.
So does the meeting just end if there's no longer a quorum?
If you have somebody stand up, walk out, say, I'm not coming back, I'm not returning, your quorum's not here any longer, then we would close the meeting at that point in time.
So my question is more technical then, Mark. So if that happens in reality, how do you take a vote to recess the meeting?
It would close by operational law. You'd have your CFO put on the record that the board president makes a observation that quorum is no longer present. By operation of law, we no longer have a quorum. The meeting must close. Typically, I mean, if somebody gets fed up and says, I'm walking out, I'm out of here, that's normally when this would occur, rather than, somebody might have an emergency. They might have to leave as well. So typically, if there is an emergency, the board president has the ability, and you'll see, on this, closing a meeting, doesn't require debate or anything like that. We just take a vote. So if somebody has to leave unexpectedly, take a vote real quick, close the meeting correctly, and then, and then you've actually closed your meeting, you have your minutes, everything is fine like that. But if somebody, leaves, and you're no longer have a quorum in this room, then we would put that on the record. Board president would make the observation. Then for the meeting minutes, our CFO would make that notation, and the meeting would be closed. So.
And so also, if someone is just in the restroom at the time of a vote, do we just have to take a recess at that time? Or can you go to another part of the agenda that doesn't?
You would need a majority to table the item, to move it to later in the meeting, to delay that vote. But again, you would need at least a majority there to be able to table that item. Because tabling something requires a vote. So if somebody stands up, walks out, we only have 3 people in this room, needs to go to the restroom, board president would either say, stand at ease, so everybody else stays in their place. This person, we wait for that person to come back from the restroom, and then we can proceed on with that. Or we would, we would have to declare the meeting as no longer an open meeting and have to close it if that person's not going to come back. So we would want to, we could either take a recess. If that's a longer time, then we're going to call a recess. If somebody has to step out for 15 minutes, then we'll talk about recess. And recess is standing at ease and those type of things, and what we would do at the time. But you can always, we can close the meeting, we can end the session, and then open the session back up. If it's, if you need to delay for an hour, something like that, then we could recess or, close the session for an hour, come back to the same meeting session. I mean, there are ways, or, something under the procedure that allows us to do that, but we would want to use the correct, depending on when that person's going to come back, which is the procedure that's best for that timing. So.
And this is only when we have just 4 of us, right? We're talking about. Not
This is when you only have,
4.
you go from 4 to 3. When it's when you have that only 3 people in the room. That's when we need to, make that observation as to what we're going to do to proceed. If you have 7 members,
You can take a vote, yeah.
You have 7 members, you have 2 people walk out, you can continue with your business. The quorum's still here, and it would still be valid. And normally in the minutes, if somebody's going to leave in the middle of a meeting, it would be referenced in the minutes, so and so, left the meeting at what such and such a time. That would normally be stated. If somebody comes late to a meeting, it would also say, like we started a meeting at 10:05. If somebody came in at 10:12, we would say, this board member, was present at 10:12, whatever it may be. So that information could be included in the minutes. Anything else about those items? Okay, so this is on page 5, item number 2. Unless otherwise set forth in the agenda, the meeting follows the established order of business that specifies the sequence in which class of business or items are brought up or permitted to be introduced. The board president, again, is designated to oversee the meeting and calls for the different classes of business to be prescribed in their order. So we establish an agenda as a common practice here, and we'll talk about agendas further. And the board, it's the board president's. Under their authority, the board president is the one that you are to follow the agenda unless there's been a decision of the board to move something around. And that's something we're going to talk about is how do you move something from the agenda? Do you table it until later in the meeting? Do you postpone it until a later meeting? Do you postpone it until a different time? There are certain mechanisms. If you don't want to bring something to a vote at that time or not discuss it at that time, then we would move that agenda item later under one of those procedures. And there's also ways for board members to enforce that the agenda is followed as well. And we'll talk about this in further detail.
Does the board have to vote? I've seen it both ways. Does the board have to vote to accept the board agenda?
We're going to talk about it,
Okay,
but short answer is if you do vote, you will follow that agenda as adopted. Correct.
You can't modify it.
Unless there's a 2/3 vote at a later time to move an agenda item, to change the agenda. Normally, the first order of business is, we had a special meeting today. We didn't read the minutes from the previous meeting. So that, maybe sometimes they aren't prepared, whatever it is. But, reading of the minutes is normally your first agenda item after you have your normal formalities. The first item is the reading of the minutes. Revised Code 331326. So traditionally, you read, verbatim what the minutes were. 331326 of Ohio Revised Code allows the Board of Education to waive the reading of the minutes at the beginning of a meeting. So if you have the minutes at your place, if you've had them at least 2 days prior to the next succeeding meeting of the board and copies of the minutes are made available to the public or news media, then you don't have to explicitly read the minutes from the previous meeting at your meeting. That being said, the board should pass either a law allows a resolution to be passed or in board policy for the board to waive the reading of the minutes. So we would want something on the record that says the board has decided to waive the reading of the minutes. So whether that's a resolution that goes in perpetuity or that's something in your board policy, then you would want to make sure you're compliant with Ohio Revised Code 331326 that the board has authorized the waiving of the reading of the minutes. And again, in order to waive the minutes, you have to have them available 2 days prior to the meeting to all the board members and then have them available to the public upon request. So we're going to next talk about recesses, standing at ease. How do we delay the meeting if necessary? So a recess is a short intermission or break within a meeting that does not end the meeting or destroy its continuity as a single gathering, and after which the meeting proceedings are immediately resumed at the point where they were interrupted. During a recess, members may leave the hall or room in which the meeting is being held, but they are expected to remain nearby. A motion to recess requires a second and is subject to a majority vote. So again, this is to actually move forward with a recess, we require a second and majority vote, but there is no debate necessary. So like if we wanted to take a break around 11:15, and everybody wants to stand up, somebody needs to use the restroom, needs to get something to drink, we would want it to move for a recess and give 5-minute recess. Standing at ease. This is a meeting is said to stand at ease if the board president, without objection, simply permits a brief pause without declaration of a recess. In such a case, there's technically no interruption of the meeting and the members remain in their places. Quiet conversation among the board members may take place, but it must cease immediately when the board president again declares the meeting in order or any member objects to continuing to stand at ease. So again, if somebody went to the restroom, we need to stand at ease so we can have a quorum back here. The board president would declare, we're going to stand at ease. Everybody else should stay at their place. We shouldn't mill around. Not everybody's going to be dismissed to go to the restroom. Then that person can come back in. We can, have the meeting back in order once that person does return. So those are the two processes we would use. So if it's a little bit longer, let's take a recess. If it's something where everybody just, we need to get some papers shuffled in, we would stand at ease. Adjournment of the meeting. This closes or terminates the meeting. In ordinary practice, a meeting is closed by adopting a motion to simply adjourn. A motion to adjourn requires a second and a majority vote, but it's not debatable or subject to amendment. After the vote, the board president then declares the meeting is adjourned, and the adjournment closes the meeting. So that would be, that is a signal to the recording secretary that the meeting's been closed, and the recording secretary can then prepare the minutes from that meeting that was closed. Filling of a board member vacancy. So this is if somebody has vacated their position or has we have a vacancy on the board. This is governed by Ohio law rather than Robert's Rules of Order. While this Robert's Rule of Order does have a procedure, since Ohio law has a procedure, it's going to supersede what Robert's Rules of Order say. A vacancy is filled by a majority vote of the remaining members that stay on the board. The appointment must occur at the board's next regular or special meeting, but not earlier than 10 days after the vacancy. But it must occur within 30 days of the vacancy. So you have a very limited 20-day window to fill a vacancy on a board when it occurs. Otherwise, the board is divested of its power to appoint a replacement, and actually you notify the court of the probate court. The probate court then would appoint somebody. So often, sometimes board members can't agree on who should be that replacement, and there's not consensus. In that instance, if you haven't filled that vacancy within the 10 to 30-day window, then it must be referred to the probate court. The probate court makes a decision on who's going to fill that vacancy, and the probate court doesn't have to refer to the individuals that are recommended to the probate court. The probate court could, if he wants his neighbor to be on the board, he's going to appoint the neighbor. So immediately after the vote, the treasurer must give notice to the Board of Elections that the vacancy on the board has been filled and the name of the person appointed. So if you do, in that 10 to 20-day window, have that vacancy filled, then the treasurer, CFO, is required to provide that notice. The statute also controls the length of time the appointed board member will serve in the position and when an election must be held to fill the position for the remainder of the term. So if somebody leaves with, you're going to leave mid-term, that person got elected. The person selected to fill the vacancy shall hold office for the shorter of the following periods. So until the completion of the unexpired term, so if the unexpired term is 3 months, then there wouldn't need to be an election, or until the January 1 immediately following the next regular Board of Education election more than 90 days after the person is selected. So that's a lot of, a lot of timelines there. So a special election may need to occur if that person vacated not too far into the term and there's not a whole lot of time remaining into it, and you would want to analyze what the actual date of resignation is to make sure whether the Board of Elections needs to be put on notice that that a special election would need to occur to fill somebody in that position for the remainder of the term. So that special election must be held unless the expired term ends on or before January 1, immediately following the regular Board of Education election. So that's what we follow. And again, this is a technical timelines that we want to follow. You'd want to consult your board legal counsel as to when an election would be needed when a vacancy occurs. Next, we're going to turn to agendas. how agendas work, how do we enforce the agenda, how do we stay on the agenda, when should things be moved around in the agenda. That's the next item for how the meeting should operate. The purpose of creating an agenda in advance of a meeting is to provide members with items or topics that plan to be covered at the meeting so the members can be adequately prepared. Typically, your board president, in consultation with the administration, are the individuals that put the agenda together. Normally, it's the recording secretary that has the authority or ability to make sure that gets distributed. Sometimes it's the secretary of the recording secretary that actually distributes it, but those are the individuals that have the designated requirements to get the agenda prepared and under Robert's Rules of Order, and make sure it gets circulated within the timelines, because as you saw, there are some times when you want the agenda and the minutes provided to the board members at a certain amount of time in advance to make sure that we can waive reading of the minutes, have the agenda set in that thing, those types of items. That being said, board members certainly can raise items or have items, recommend items be put on the agenda. So it's normally common practice that if we want to talk about this matter, then we would have the board member recommend that to be included on the agenda. Certainly, yep.
When that happens, is there a certain time you have to do that before putting it on that agenda, or you just raise it on the meeting?
You would, for your item to actually appear on the written agenda, you would want to have that ahead of the meeting. If there are items that you want to include on the agenda, you show up to the meeting, and it's not on the agenda, then at the beginning of the meeting, before the agenda is, and we're going to talk about setting the agenda, before it's set, then we would want to add those items under some new business or something like that on your agenda prior to the agenda being approved or moved forward with. So.
If I came to the meeting today, and we're having a meeting, and I have 3 things I want to put on the agenda, and we've already gotten our agenda several days before, I can bring it and put it on the agenda?
It's not recommended practice.
Right.
But we can add things to the agenda. There is a procedure that allows it to occur. So again, we have to also comply with the Ohio Open Meetings Act. So if you have a special board meeting like today, and you would have brought 3 items for us to discuss, if it wasn't noticed on that special board meeting notice in the newspaper, we can't talk about that. The only things we're confined to is what is on our agenda as noticed for a special board meeting. If it's your general regular board meetings, your ones that happen, whatever it is, every other Tuesday, whatever your, I don't know when your board routinely meets, but on a general board meeting, there's a procedure where you could add items to the agenda or bring topics in to make sure they get included on the agenda prior to that meeting.
Because the only reason I asked that, because if you say you put them on, say, the day of, and what if 3 of us or 5 of us have 3 different items? You're never going to get done with your meeting.
Correct.
So you need to make sure that there's a procedure that maybe comes beforehand before we do that.
And you can set in your bylaws, we need to have agenda items prepared, 5 days in advance, because there is a requirement that certain things need to be notified to the board within 2 days prior to the meeting. So if it doesn't appear on the agenda, then there's a possibility to, and this is under Ohio law and not Robert's Rules of Order, that those items couldn't appear for discussion at your board meeting because they weren't noticed a certain amount of time ahead of time. But again, that's something that, it's a practice that the school district or school board would need to put in place, as well as what the Ohio law says. So.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to make sure that, because I wouldn't want 4 of us to come in with items the same day, and make sure that we're clear about it, that we do have a standard time that our agenda items are set, and then we adopt that agenda, and then we move forward on that day of the meeting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, quick question. So,
Yes.
For example, I'm assuming that the procedure, if a board member does obviously decide to put something on the agenda that does not appear on the agenda, it's better to get it in advance than at the day of the meeting, clearly. and that information should be routed through the board president, correct?
Correct. Yep.
And then secondly, is in terms of establishing some guidelines, is that permissible to put those under administrative guidelines and not directly in a policy?
You would want to have it in your bylaws. So bylaws adopted by the board are what the board
So
would govern.
in policy then?
Yeah, your administrative guidelines
Okay.
are what superintendent, HR, treasurer's office
Right.
set to kind of govern your employees. Your Board of Education isn't beholden to your administrative guidelines. Sometimes your board will adopt your administrative guidelines, but administrative guidelines are what the administrators do rather than what the board does. So yeah, we would recommend that be in your bylaws if you're going to set an item in there.
Okay.
So again, and this is kind of unique. Most boards of education use an agenda, so it's pretty common, but there's no actual legal requirement in Ohio that boards of education use an agenda, nor is there any language in the revised code that discusses how they're prepared or amended. So this is strictly a Robert's Rule of Order or a procedural matter or a bylaw or a type of matter that you would set criteria for your agenda. There's nothing under the law that says a Board of Education must have an agenda. That being said, under the Open Meetings Act, there is a reference to agendas. So there are times where the mailing of an anticipated agenda as an option for providing your advance notification of a meeting. So like when you publish your meeting, like if you're having a special meeting, you would have to have an agenda or the items that are going to be discussed for that meeting, or it's a way to provide to, if you have your local newspaper, they request notification of every meeting ahead of the meeting. So whenever notifications occur, you would provide, in addition to a copy of that notice of the meeting, a copy of your agenda as well. So that's something that Ohio law does refer to that. It's not something that is in law that requires an agenda to actually be prepared before a meeting. It's certainly recommended to have an agenda because it provides a guide map for how your meetings would end rather than just people bringing up whatever business they want to discuss it at whatever time.
Mr. Jackson, I just want to say for clarification to the board members, I don't think we currently have anything in our policy, but our practice is to have any items submitted 7 days before so that the administration has time to gather whatever information it is so that it can be a proper discussion on the agenda. So 7 days is what we're aiming for, and I guess hopefully we can get that to policy committee.
Yep.
So and I think that's fair time. So I just wanted to say that out loud.
Yeah, and to follow up, I think actually we have in there that we would post the agenda 7 days. I'll double check on that, but I think we did say that we would have an agenda posted 7 days.
Yeah. It certainly would be advisable to have either a procedure that everybody's willing to comply with. If there's, I guess if your board has a member that's consistently not following that procedure, then you would want to insert something explicit into your bylaws to make sure it's more enforceable against that board member. But this is one of those things that practice says one thing, policy's much more enforceable than an actual practice. So I guess it depends on the board how detailed you want to go into those deadlines or timelines. Yes.
Sorry, and so if my memory serves, and sorry, brain fog today, but if memory serves and it is that the agenda would be posted 7 days, then our recommendation should be that requests are before 7 days. If our agenda is posted 7 days, then our communication, our conversation needs to be even in advance of that.
Okay, next item is approving the agenda. So under Robert's Rules of Order, if the board does not adopt the agenda at the beginning of the meeting, so if you enter your meeting and say we want to adopt the agenda, or there's a motion to adopt the agenda, if you do not have that type of approval at the beginning of the meeting, a majority vote is required to amend the agenda. So if there's something that we want to move out of order, change the order of something on the agenda, then only a majority vote is required to, move that, whether it's table it till later in the meeting or postpone it, then only a majority vote's required. But if the board adopts its agenda at the beginning of the meeting, a two-thirds vote is required to change the agenda later in the meeting after its adoption. So if you have approved your agenda, then you would want to have a two-thirds vote to table something, move it around, add something to the agenda.
Can the administration remove agenda? Let's say an agenda's posted. Does the administration have the authority to amend an agenda after it's been publicly posted, or as long as it's before the start of a meeting?
And again, if you have your agenda set like 7 days in advance,
right?
Okay, then you would. This all goes through the board president. So the board president is your kind of gatekeeper of all of this. So the administration would consult with the board president and say, we want to take this item out. Board president says, okay, let's take it out. Now, you need to make sure that if we have an amended agenda, that amended agenda still meets any legal requirements. So if it's 2 days in advance of the board meeting that you have to have an agenda item noticed to your board members, then you would want to make sure that that agenda item is still on there, or you couldn't take it off within that 2-day period. So we would want to make sure the law is also filed if we're going to have an amended agenda where we're taking stuff off. You understand what I'm saying? So if you have an agenda set,
I'm not sure I'm 100% clear, no.
So let's say we set our agenda 7 days prior to the meeting, okay? The administration then comes to the board president and says, we've got an item on personnel. We got a resignation out of this person instead of a termination. We need to take this off the agenda, okay? The board president would say, okay, that's fine. Let's take it off the agenda. We got the resignation. We're going to put on there approval of resignation of XYZ person, okay? As long as Ohio law doesn't prohibit us from noticing that within the 2-day period, then you can amend that agenda prior to the board meeting.
So it depends on the item.
It depends on the type of item.
It's 2 days or it doesn't.
Yeah, there's sometimes it's a 24-hour notice, special meeting. You've got something on a special meeting. It has to be noticed at least 24 hours in advance of the meeting.
But generally speaking, recommendations from the administration would not need to be 2-day noticed.
Generally, no. It would. Okay. Most of your items are 24 hours or even before a meeting, but there are certain things that are 2 days, some things are 24 hours, and it depends on your type of meeting as well. Right. So there's all these different things at play. And if you set something by your bylaws, if you say all agenda items need to be in here 7 days in advance, and if we want to remove an agenda item under 7 days, then it has to go through these steps, discretion of the board president, whatever it is. Then we would want to include that in the bylaws as well. So, yes.
Quick question. I guess this is more for the board that was previously here. Did you guys vote on 7 days to make the agenda to be posted 7 days?
We did.
You voted on that?
Because in old times, we were getting the agenda maybe on a Friday, and we had a board meeting on a Monday. And so that we stated there wasn't enough time for us to get all this information to read, because you know how weekends are, and you got to come in. So we said 7 days before, so we got it earlier. That way we can look at it, and if we have any questions, we can bring it to the superintendent or discuss it and then get it back on the agenda. That's the reason why. So we have time, because we didn't have enough time. 2 days is not really enough time to look at the agenda, and we have any questions and so forth to do so with.
So I guess what I'm asking, is it 7 days it has to be posted? Or is it 7 days you guys are giving information? We're giving information. I'm just trying to ask before I came on. Was it you have 7 days to provide the secretary with the information that needs to be on the agenda?
Right.
And then how many days? And maybe I should have asked this before coming on. How many days do we have? How many days is it supposed to be posted before our meeting?
I think it's 7. To be honest, I'm not sure. I have to check, but I think it is 7.
It's 7. It has to be posted.
So it's okay then. I guess I'm confused. You're saying 7 days to notify the secretary of what's going to be on the agenda. And then the same 7 days it has to be posted. That can't be right because they won't have time to
It's the
create the agenda.
The administration, they have time. We wanted to give them time to make sure they got it on to whoever goes. I'm not exactly sure who it goes, whether it goes to the treasurer or whoever goes who sets the agenda. So they got that information. Okay. Then we wanted to make sure we got it in time. So we said, I think it was 10 days and 7 days when we got it. Maybe 10 days that they had to get it to them, and then 7 days they got it to us, so we have time to read the information.
But then it has to be posted within a certain period of time. So what is that period of time it has to be posted? Saying that everything is accurate and that, Ms. Ruth, maybe you can answer that. When do we have to post it? Okay. Okay. Because with Robert rules, we do have to post it for the public within so many
We
days.
have to notice the meeting in 3
There has to be
days.
notice and
Under
posting.
We have
Ohio's
to
so many
notice
days.
it to the public by 3 days.
So that's what I'm asking.
if I'm
That's what I'm
correct.
asking. So is it 7 days, or you're saying
If
it has
I'm
to be
correct,
posted to the
it's 3.
public 3 days? It comes to the board within 7 days, right?
Right.
So then if we have to make any changes, we have however many days to give that corrected information, but it has to be posted via website or wherever it needs to be posted 3 days, right? So is that 3 business days for us? So technically it would be posted Wednesday, since our meeting is that Monday?
Business days.
No, it's calendar days.
It's calendar days? Okay, perfect. Okay, just wanted clarity on
Because it's
that.
usually posted by Thursday. It's usually posted by Thursday
Yeah.
to the
The
public.
public, yes.
Okay, so is all this like in writing, where you said usually, so we have to post it by Thursday, right? So Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, right? Okay, all right. Thank you.
All right. Yes.
Madam Chair, just to follow up on that, I don't recall, but perhaps it's there, the policy in removing items off of the agenda. What is the time? We heard our speaker indicate that 24 hours on some areas, in some areas 2 days notices to remove from other topics. So what does the policy says, or is it silent? Because I can't remember reading that in policy.
I honestly do not have the policy in front of me. But my understanding from what you're saying, it depends on what the item is. So some administrative things, like recommendations or resolutions, can be removed that day. But there's certain
There are
things.
times at the beginning of the meeting, if you want to remove something from the agenda, you can have a majority vote to remove those items from the agenda as well. But again,
The vote.
it would go to vote, and it also depends on the item as to whether we would be changing the agenda as well. So if it's something that you still have to, if it's something you have to consider and you can't remove it from the agenda, then even a vote is not going to be valid under Ohio law. And there's only a few things where that would occur. But if it's something that we all get into this room, there's something on the agenda that doesn't need to be covered prior to approving your agenda, you can vote to remove something from the agenda, and we can talk about tabling something to later in the meeting or postponing something on the agenda. And again, this would be another thing that would be subject to a vote. So there's various procedures in place depending on what you want to do. If you want to completely remove it, we would vote for it.
Is that in this information?
Excuse me,
Oh, I'm sorry,
I still have the
I'm
floor.
sorry, okay.
Madam Chair, so my question is it silent? And I don't remember seeing anything dealing with the time that items should be pulled or can be pulled from the agenda. So my question is, am I correct in that it's not there, so it's silent?
I think up until this point it has
Okay.
been, but I think we need to
Okay.
to pull it and look. And I don't
Thank you, Madam
know.
Chair. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, I'm sorry, Madam Chair. Let me make sure I use this right. Question. the information we're talking about, removing things from the item, is this going to be in this documentation, or is that something you can get to us so we know of that?
Yeah, we can. We'll talk about We'll talk about removing and postponing and tabling in this outline. I think we have another session planned as well. From this session to that one, we can also talk about, or I can also look up what's actually written in your policy, if there is anything about removing agenda items and adding agenda items and those types of things.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
And there may not be anything in policy. There may be explicit things in policy. So we'll look at that before we prepared for that question next time around. So next item is rarely used. This is more of a decorum rule, and this is referenced on page 8 at the top of the page. This is called a motion to call for orders of the day. If the board president consistently performs the duty of announcing business to come before the board in its proper order, there is no need or occasion for calling orders of the day. It's a privilege motion. There's no vote required, no second required. It's not debatable. A single member can say, I call for orders of the day, which means the board president should strictly stay with the agenda. And if the board president wants to deviate from that agenda, it would require, depending on whether the agenda is approved, it would take 2/3 vote to deviate, or it would take just a majority vote if the agenda wasn't approved at the beginning of the meeting. But again, this is something that, some board member may perceive that the board president is abusing power and changing things around, but if it's something that the board president doesn't do routinely, it's not something that really should be enforced. It's more of a decorum rule. Most board agendas contain items, and this is a list under Part D. Business may come up automatically at certain times or at a certain point in the order of business if it had been previously postponed. So if we do postpone something and say, we're not going to vote on it or discuss it at this meeting, but we want to discuss it at the May meeting, then you can take a vote to postpone an item to a future meeting, and it doesn't have to be the next immediate meeting. It can be several future meetings down the road. So, but we'll talk about postponing and that procedure through this as well. Taking business up out of its proper order, or this is referred to suspending the rules. Any particular item of business can be taken up out of its proper order by adopting a motion to suspend the rules by a 2/3 vote or unanimous consent. So if the board president says we need to address a item, or a board member says we need to take up this item that's further on our agenda, we want to suspend the rules, bring that up. So depending on the procedure, the board can you can just say any objection to suspending the rules and bringing this item earlier in the agenda, then the board president can do that. That would go to the board. That would go to the remainder of the board, though. The board president can say any objection, and if there's any objection, you would want to voice your objection at that point in time. If there is an objection, then it goes 2/3 vote of the majority of the board. So if we're going to move that around. A motion to suspend the rules requires a second, but is not debatable, and requires a 2/3 vote to pass if we don't have unanimous consent on the vote. Use of a consent agenda. So this is a practice that we've seen with a lot of boards. A consent agenda allows a board to approve several items together without discussion or debate. This should be limited to routine agenda items that deal with procedures, issues that have already been discussed, are grouped together, freeing up time for more substantial discussion on other issues. So typically, the consent agenda items are routine procedural decisions that are not likely to be controversial. Oftentimes, you'll have a consent agenda on the treasurer has routine payments that have to be made. You've already got the contract approved, those types of things. We just need to adopt all the payments from a previous month or whatever it is. That could be something you include on your consent agenda. Matters, appointments to committees, that's referenced in Robert's Rules of Order, but we're going to talk about committees later. I'm sorry to delay some of these things. Final approval of proposals or reports. So if you've had a report presented to the board already, and you want to consider it, the discussion's already occurred, you want to postpone that, that can be used to be approved on your consent agenda. There is a recommended procedure for consent items. This is detailed on page 9. Items to be included on the consent agenda must be known in advance, distributed with the board meeting package and reviewed by all board members prior to the meeting. When the consent agenda portion of the meeting occurs, the board president asks the members if they wish for any items to be removed from the consent agenda and discussed individually. If any member requests that an item be removed from the consent agenda, it must be removed. There is no need for a motion, second, or vote whether that item should be removed from the consent agenda. Members may request that an item be removed for any reason and do not need to state their reason for the item to be removed. If an item is removed from the consent agenda, the board president places the item at a later discussion item on the meeting agenda. When preparing the minutes of the meeting, the treasurer includes the full text of the resolutions, reports, or recommendations that were adopted as part of the consent agenda. So this is, if we have a consent agenda, a board member decides, we think we should provide further discussion, deliberation of this item. It's more than just things that should be approved through a consent agenda. Any board member can raise that. And it doesn't require a second, it doesn't require a vote. Any board member can say, this item's too important for us to just approve through a consent agenda. That, in those instances, we would take that off the consent agenda and put it in the board meeting as a courtesy to that board member. So it's not something that any other board member can say, we think it should still stay on the consent agenda. We're going to take it off, we're going to consider it, because at least one person believes it has that much importance.
Something on a consent agenda could still be debated, though, correct?
You can, yes.
Without removing it from the consent agenda.
You can debate items. It's not necessarily recommended, but it's something that, you can open your consent agenda to debate if you wanted to, but
okay.
Again, if there's no reason to have it on a consent agenda right. if we're going to debate an item.
Yeah, so it would be more appropriate procedure to remove it and then have the
pull
debate.
It off, put it as its own individual agenda item, and then discuss and debate and approve at that point.
Got it.
Be cautious about.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Madam Chair, with the consent agenda, it seems to be the norm of the board that quite often members will still make reference to items on the consent agenda and make a comment, as in, I recognize someone is retiring or something to that effect. So I would ask our speaker today, if we are going to comment on an item on the consent agenda, what would be recommended as to would you recommend that we take it off of the consent agenda to make reference to it and to discuss it?
If you're going to comment about it,
yes.
Or if there's going to be any reference to it aside from this just being a routine matter,
yeah.
It's recommended to pull it off.
Right.
And even if it just has a cursory discussion, minimal discussion, simple vote afterwards, it's better to not have that on the consent agenda, because consent agenda, as you'll see, we're going to talk about this case that happened recently, and this is kind of on that point. Mm-hmm. There was there's an individual, and most people are aware of, there's a couple individuals throughout the state that often file a lot of challenges to Ohio Open Meetings Act, Public Records Acts, they seem to be watchdogs. There was a case filed against the Portage County Board of Commissioners that, in that case, they used a consent agenda for almost all their items that they would approve. And there would be a discussion of them, but they'd also have meetings where they just met, everything's on a consent agenda, we approve it, and we moved on. It's not recommended to handle your board meetings that way. It was challenged. The board in that, or the court in that case did uphold the use of the consent agenda, but also had some pretty, harsh words towards the board for using a consent agenda on items that they shouldn't have. So even though the individual that filed that lawsuit was not granted any fees, any sort of violation occurred of the Open Meetings Act, there was some guidance provided. So that's a situation where there are people out there that are going to scrutinize your minutes and your meetings, And in instances where we are going to talk about something that's on a consent agenda, it's best to pull it off. Also, with a consent agenda, if you're going to use one, it's best to have a statement in your board policy, and I'm not sure if I checked the board policy or not on it, that says the board will use consent agenda for routine, and I kind of referenced it up here, routine, procedural, non-controversial items. So we would recommend some sort of statement in your policy that says that you have the ability to use a consent agenda. Any other questions on agendas or anything? Next we're gonna move on to like actual nuts and bolts of motions and resolutions. Hearing none. Okay, so we're going to talk about making motions, what motions are available, what a resolution is, and how those are made. So the difference between a motion and a resolution is that motions are made orally while resolutions are presented in writing. The board considers, discusses, and acts on both. You treat them both the same in the analysis of how they're handled in a meeting, but basically one's in writing, one's made orally, and both have the same effect if passed. So first we'll talk about motions. What's the correct way to make and adopt a motion? Motions should be stated in the affirmative. Generally this means that somebody making a motion says, I move. When making a motion, it's not really proper under Robert's rule to say, I make a motion, or I motion that, and then say what the motion is. The superintendent and treasurer do not have authority to make motions. They can recommend motions because they're not members of the board. They can make recommendations. They can draft motions and resolutions for the board members to present, but ultimately it's a board member that should be proposing your motion or your resolution in a meeting. After a motion has been proposed, another member must second the motion. While the board president can often ask for a second, the board president, it's not required. If a motion is proposed and somebody else is willing to second that motion, that person on the board can say, I second, or simply second. If there isn't a second, the board member or the board president, or if it's routine for the board president to say, do I have a second, something like that, then there's timing for a second. The second implies only that the member is willing to hear discussion on the motion. Doesn't mean that you're actually supporting that motion. The board member who makes the second is not required to vote in favor of support of the motion. There should be no discussion of a motion before it's seconded. So if somebody proposes a motion and then they go into some explanation of why there is this motion, what they hope to accomplish with the motion, none of that discussion should occur until there is a second. The motion should be proposed, it should be seconded, and then we move to the next step. If the motion does not receive a second, the motion is not considered at all, there's no discussion, and it ultimately fails. So your treasurer CFO would put on the record that a motion was proposed by such and such board member, no second occurred, the motion fails. And then the board president will immediately say, next item of business. So the board president would announce there's not a second, and then proceed with the next item on the agenda. Once the motion has been presented and seconded, the board president states the motion as presented. So the board president should restate the motion so that everybody knows what the actual language of the motion is. So until the board president states the motion, the maker of the motion may modify or withdraw it. So that triggers the person that has raised the motion to clarify the terminology that's being used in the motion. After the question has been stated by the board president, the motion becomes an action item for the board, and the maker cannot amend or withdraw without the remainder of the board's consent. So when a motion is proposed and seconded, that person that has proposed the motion still can make some adjustments to the language of the motion. But once the board president says the motion being considered by the board is XYZ, whatever that statement is, then it's in the board's hands. And to make any changes or amendments or revisions to it, the board would then need to vote to consent to those changes. Okay, so after a motion has been made, but before the board president states it, any member can request without waiting to be recognized, can address the board president to inquire with the maker that the motion be modified. So if somebody has some input, I think the motion should be amended as XYZ. If the board president hasn't restated the motion or stated the motion to put it in front of the board, then input can occur from the board members. I recommend that the motion be revised to XYZ. It's still in the hands of the maker of the motion until the second and the board president has read the motion. The maker would respond through the board president as to whether the maker is willing to make the modification or reject the modification. Once the board president states the motion is before the body, and you must do something with it. You must either vote it down, you must postpone it, you must table it, and if you table it, you have to come back to it at a certain period of time. It doesn't just go into the ether if we decide not to do anything with it. It's still a motion before the board. Something must occur. Ultimately, after this step, that's what D says. I'm repeating myself. The basic form used by the president in stating the question in an ordinary motion is, it is moved and seconded that, and then repeat what's ultimately what the motion is. And then it brings up member debate. So any questions on proposing motions, seconding motions, revising those motions prior to the board president stating the motion, or once it's been proposed to the board that we have to do something with it? Those are all pretty important. So once we have all of those steps followed, we go to debate. And members, then this is in the hands of the board president. The board president then recognizes individuals to speak on a motion, to discuss it, to debate it. The board president, typically, it is common and it is recommended to recognize the person that made the motion has the first opportunity to speak about that motion. So whoever was the maker, that's the first person that you get to talk in support of or to discuss the motion. If the maker changes position during debate, the member may move to withdraw that motion. But again, since the motion is before the board at this point, the board is the one in control of it. The board can then vote to say, yes, you have the ability to withdraw. Yes, you have the ability to modify. But once that's stated and debate has started, then any changes to it, any withdrawing of it would be up to the consent of the remainder of the board. After the presenting member is done, someone else can speak for or against the motion. The member should be recognized by the board president prior to offering the member's discussion debate. So if there's somebody else that wants to speak on it, the board president then could recognize the next person down the line. Members who have not spoken should be recognized by the board president before members seeking to speak for a second time. So if you have, for instance, we go down the line, we have two people speak on it. The original person that brought the motion up, they've already spoken once. Everybody else should have an opportunity to speak on it before we go back to that person. Any questions?
Mark, is there a reason? So I see in your notes here that the maker of the motion must speak in favor of the motion.
Typically, that is recommended.
But
yes.
I saw there that the second does not have to speak in favor of the motion. Why is there a difference there?
So a second means this item is important enough to consider by the board, whether you agree with it or disagree with it, but we need to have some discussion about it. And somebody that seconds it is basically saying, I think whether I agree with it or disagree with it, we need to at least discuss it. If there is no second, if you have, you got 7 board members here and nobody seconds it, nobody believes that motion has enough importance to even be brought up before the board. So it's whether we want to put something on the record about the item we want to discuss, or if it's something that everybody else disagrees with completely. At least we would have some discussion about it to make that decision before voting it down.
That makes sense.
Yep.
But it's not a violation of the rules to make the motion but then speak against it. It's just not done.
You shouldn't raise a motion and then speak against it.
Yeah. Okay. But it's not a violation of the rules.
That being said, there's times where you present a motion and there's discussion of it. you change your mind about it. I really don't think this was, now thinking about it from everybody else's input, I don't think it's appropriate. I'm going to speak against it. That person then probably should move to withdraw it. And at that point, since it's been discussed by the board, you would have your entire board vote at that time as to whether to allow the board member to withdraw that motion or not. So, and that would take, we'd follow what's required to get that passed. So after that person after we've had everybody go around, have a chance to speak, every board member has the right to speak on every debatable motion before it is finally acted upon. And generally, under Robert's rules, they say you should have 2 opportunities to speak on something, but not more unless there is a permission granted to speak more than twice on something. That's a standard. That's what Robert's rule sets. So a board may also pass a subsidiary motion to limit or extend debate on a motion. If additional discussion is desired, you can submit a subsidiary motion to extend the debate on an item, or you can also limit it. Everybody only needs to talk about this once. It's not that big of a deal. Let's speak about it once. You can say, we want to limit discussions of debate. The motion can then, determine how much we speak about something. That if you do present one of those motions to either extend or limit debate, it must be seconded. It's not debatable, and must be approved by 2/3 of the majority. So if you want to proceed with the ability to talk more or less about a motion, then we should consider one of those subsidiary motions. When the board adopts a motion to limit or extend the limits of debate, it is said to adopt an order taking such action. So it's not you're approving a motion there, it's actually an order. And then when that order is done, it's said it's been exhausted. So that's just terminology under Robert's Rules of Order. Members may request others to offer information in debate of a motion by asking the board president if the non-member may be recognized to speak. So let's say we want to have the superintendent's input. We want to have CFO treasurer's input on an item that we have up for discussion. A board member should raise that to the board chair. We'd like to hear from the superintendent about this item. And then the superintendent, board president would say, I approve. Superintendent, please, talk. And then superintendent would talk through the board chair, board president, to the remainder of the board. With controversial issues, the board president is advised to consider switching back and forth between those speaking in favor of the motion and those speaking against it, or allowing for rebuttal. So if you know that where people stand possibly on an issue, it's best to go back and forth so that there's some debate rather than saying we're going to pile on one way or the other. So sometimes items get heated and discussion gets heated. So it's always best to maintain that decorum that we talked about. So especially with items where there might be some, division. Don't bring personal items into it. Don't say, don't attack somebody personally. Speak through the chair about the person in their board member capacity. We don't want to go beyond their capacity as a board member. It's recommended not to make this a time to have personal attacks. Also, you want to keep those remarks to the task at hand. We don't want to bring in superfluous other discussions or items or previous agenda items in discussion of the current agenda item. Address remarks to the chair. Officers of the board should be referred to by their official titles. So Mr., Mrs., board president, board vice president, those titles rather than referring to somebody by their first name is recommended. Refrain from disrupting the board. So if somebody wants to talk in opposition, obtain the consent of the chair before just interjecting. So this would apply throughout those motion discussions. Any questions about discussion or opening that up, having a motion discussed? So if you want to amend a pending motion, so this is, somebody has a change of heart, or something, once the motion is before the board and we need to make an adjustment to it in the language, motions may be amended while they are under consideration only. If you've passed something, if it's subject to a vote, we shouldn't be amending it at that time. Once debate has begun, then the control is the board's. The maker can request unanimous consent to modify a motion. If any member then objects, however, the desired modification must be introduced in the form of a motion to amend. Under a subsidiary motion to amend, members can propose changes to be made in the wording before it is voted on. These amendments must be seconded, are debatable, and are adopted by a majority vote. So if we have an actual motion to amend, it's a subsidiary motion. We have to have a second for it. We would vote on it. It's subject to debate. A member can request modification of a motion through unanimous consent. The board president would handle that if it seems like everybody's on board with that change. But if not, then if we need to amend it through the process, we can have a motion to amend. And again, this is the board president would want to control this. We want to make sure the board president is presenting the modification or amendment in the specific terminology that we want to change it to, rather than something that's not concrete. When debate has closed, the board president is advised to ask, is there any further debate, to make sure we close debate. The board president repeats the motion before calling for the vote, and the board president then calls for a vote. If law requires it occur by roll call, if it's requested for roll call, if we do as a practice, everything's voted by roll call, then we would have a roll call vote. The board president would then defer to the recording secretary, the treasurer, to make that roll call vote. Once the vote's occurred, the board president announces the results of the vote and any next steps necessitated by the motion. So if a motion passes, it's said it's adopted or the motion is carried. If there are directives in that motion that the superintendent needs to carry out such and such, the treasurer needs to carry out such and such, then the board president should put on the record, treasurer is directed to execute this, a deed if we're selling a piece of property. Treasurer, board president would sign that. So those types of things we put on the record. Different from motions are resolutions. Resolutions, these are items that are presented in writing. Robert's rules state that resolutions are intended for more important or complex questions or greater formality is desired, and the member presents the motion in the form of a resolution. So oftentimes this is something written. You have a resolution prepared ahead of a meeting. It's pretty lengthy. The usual wording for a member to present a resolution is, I move the adoption of the resolution, and the resolution says resolved that, or be it resolved. Some boards of education use that terminology. It resolved that is what Robert's Rules of Order recommend as being a resolution should be prepared in advance of the meeting if possible. So if you're bringing something that's substantial, it's a resolution. It's not just a motion you're making. It's best to have that in written form presented to the board members so they can review in detail what that is prior to it being presented at the meeting. You don't want to just hand out to all 7 people, hey, I got a 3-page resolution that I'm looking to pass. We would want to have that circulated ahead of time. The board president typically reads the resolution, or if there's a specific summary for the resolution, then that can be read. But the text of the resolution should be distributed to members in advance. Since this is a public meeting, we would also want to have copies of that available to individuals that might attend the meeting, or if those are in your agenda items, you would want to have a copy of the sample resolution there as well, upon request. Resolutions go through the same process as motions, so you have to have it gets presented. There's a second. If there's a modification to it, we would want to modify that. It's in the control of the person raising the motion prior to that resolution that would be submitted to the board. The board president then says, here's the resolution. It's up for debate by the board. Then there's debate on it. Again, if there's an amendment, we would want to use that process to amend. Ultimately, it then goes to the vote of the members. So we treat it through that same process as we would a motion. Motions or resolutions offered by the board president. Sometimes this is controversial. I have some boards of education we always get questions on. To what extent can a board president bring items to the board? The board president has the authority. They are a board member. Robert's rules says the board president needs to be impartial and also, control the process and stay, in that capacity as well. But the board president also is a board member. So items can originate with a board president. There is nothing that says a board president shouldn't be bringing items up to the board. So that's also referenced in an Ohio Attorney General opinion as well. We're moving on to page 16. It is recommended the presiding officer maintains that impartiality, and discourages the presiding officer from making motions, but is not prohibited, especially on small boards of 5 or 7 members like a Board of Education. So again, we see in Robert's Rules itself that not only is it legally available, it's also under the parliamentary procedure. We're going to now talk about various subsidiary motions or privilege motions. This is starting on page 16, a motion to ratify. The motion to ratify, or also called a motion to approve or confirm, is an incidental motion that is used to confirm or make valid an action already taken that cannot become valid until approved by the board. So this is actions taken by officers, employees, committees, delegates, subordinates, or staff in exercise of their instructions or authority. Oftentimes, this comes into place where we're hiring somebody we already have had them work for a couple of days. The superintendent's brought somebody that we needed to hire. We need to fill a position, or we've already started paying on a contract. We need to ratify something or adopt something. We'd use the motion to ratify in these types of situations. A motion to ratify is a main motion. Therefore, it is subject to the formal procedure, including debate. A board can only ratify actions as if it had the right to authorize it in advance. So you can't ratify something if you didn't have authority in the first place to do it. So that's the same thing with a motion to adopt as well, or reaffirm action. So a motion to adopt is the next one. It's an incidental motion for the board to approve an officer's report or recommendations. So if let's say we have a report from the superintendent, so this is an action that was already taken by the staff. This is something that they're providing a report or recommendations relating to a question that was provided or something that they've been working on. Then we would have a motion to adopt that is what that is referred to. Reaffirming action. So sometimes a board says, well, we took action on this 2 years ago. We'd like to reaffirm that. Robert's Rules of Action says motions to reaffirm is not a proper motion that's in order. So it's something that we really shouldn't do. If something's still valid and ongoing, there's no need to reaffirm action. It serves no useful purpose, and because the original motion is still in effect. Now, if you had something that expired, then we'd want to consider that as a main motion, just as a motion. If we need a renewal of a contract, we wouldn't want to have a reaffirmance of that action. We would just say, we need a motion to to renew that contract, rather than saying we're reaffirming something. Negative motions or resolutions. So actions containing a statement in the negative should be avoided in cases where the effect of the motion is to propose that something be done, since members may become confused as to the effect of voting for or against something. So sometimes you might have an issue in the public that something that the board wants to come out against. Robert's Rules says that's not really something appropriate if you're saying we're not in favor, we're having a motion to say we're not in favor of this action by the city or whatever. You would want to take a motion that says you oppose that or declare its opposition to that motion. So something stated in the affirmative rather than something that we're stating in the negative. It's a technicality, but that's how you would want to word these things under Robert's Rules. Motion to reconsider allows a board to correct hasty, ill-advised, or erroneous actions or amend something in light of new or additional information. Motions to reconsider and motions to rescind tend to get confused amongst boards. A motion to reconsider should be made at the same meeting or maybe the succeeding meeting. So like if you took action at a previous meeting, you want to rescind something or you want to reconsider something. Then you bring out the motion to reconsider. If you pass something during this current meeting, we want to reconsider that. We don't necessarily want to pass that. So if that occurred in this meeting or in a previous meeting, then let's do a motion to reconsider. Now, a motion to rescind is a motion to cancel or strike some previous motion, resolution, order, or rule that was adopted at a previous meeting. So a little bit different. It's a little more forceful. Any member may make a motion to rescind. Again, this is subject to being seconded, debated, requires a 2/3 vote to rescind something, according to Robert's Rules of Order. Motions to rescind may not be used if the matter that was subject to the original motion has been completed on an individual's rights under the original motion has been vested. That's the same thing with a motion to reconsider. Let's say, for instance, that we approved a resignation agreement for somebody. That person, we don't like what they did. We approved a resignation agreement. We paid them off. We decided to let them go. Then they went out in the local newspaper and made statements against the board, just trashing everything. And the board decides we want to rescind that action. We don't want to pay that person anymore. We think they violated the contract, something that we disagree with. But that right's already been vested. We've already been required to make that payment under a resignation agreement. If somebody has a lump sum payment, you can't rescind something where somebody already has a vested right, something that's already been put in. You can't have buyer's remorse on something where somebody's already should be received a payment or something like that. Let's say we have a negotiated agreement that we have approved. We've reached a agreement with the union. We have buyer's remorse over it. We don't like what's in there, but that agreement's going into effect within a month or two. We've already made that agreement. The union's already approved that agreement. We wouldn't be able to, because those rights have been vested, to be able to rescind that decision because they're already entitled to those items that we granted in that contract.
So, Mark,
Yes,
how would that work if we get new information, though? If we approve something and then we find out, a week before it is set to do it, how do we? Can we do nothing in that circumstance?
So, in the instance of, let's say, we approved that resignation agreement. Yeah. We had a confidentiality provision or non-disparagement provision. This person that resigned went out and trashed the board, and we'd have to file a breach of contract action. There's other avenues that we would pursue because the agreement's already in place. So we would say you're in breach of that agreement. Not that it's not that we can rescind your agreement or we're going to rescind that action and say it's null and void at the outset because it isn't. We've already bound ourselves to that payment. So we would have to look at the correct legal avenue to challenge that decision, whatever that may be. Now, if you say, we took some action at a previous meeting, we approved this vendor. Okay, we approved a vendor to do some sort of service for our behalf, and that agreement doesn't start until August or something like that. We're a few months down the road. We learn that this person's a criminal, that we object to having this person work for us. Then we probably have a good basis to rescind that agreement and say, we aren't going to approve that agreement moving forward. But in those situations, you got to make sure that the entitlement under the agreement didn't vest yet. So whether that payment was due or whether they started services or whatever that is, we want to make sure that hasn't occurred yet under that agreement. So those are some examples. I could probably come up with a bunch of them because we get questioned this all the time. But there's some legal analysis that goes into whether a rescission would be appropriate or not. So. Next one is what's referred to as a motion to refer or a motion to commit. A motion to refer is a subsidiary motion generally used to send a pending question to an individual or group of selected persons so that the question may be carefully investigated and put into better condition for the board to consider. Let's say you got an item that I don't think we have enough information on. We want to refer that to a committee. We want to refer that to the superintendent. We want to refer that question. We don't want to make a decision on it until we have more information. We make a motion to refer or motion to commit that item to that entity so that they can do the information gathering and then bring it back to us so we can make a decision. The motion should identify the individual or committee that the question is being referred to, and it, again, is subject to the formal motion procedure, including debate and being proposed, being seconded. That can also result in the motion being or the action being postponed. So you could have a motion to refer and postpone into a certain time, so they can be combined. But we would want to put that information in our motion. Motion to call for previous question. This is a motion used to bring the board to an immediate vote on a pending question. In practice, the motion usually is made in an unqualified form, and then it applies only to the immediately pending question. The motion must be seconded, is not debatable, and not amendable. Okay, so a motion to call for previous question is to bring the board to vote on something. We don't need to deliberate about this anymore. Let's call for the previous question. Let's bring this to a vote of the board. All you need is a second, and you don't need. It doesn't have further debate. It doesn't have any further discussion. If you have a motion and a second, then the board president should proceed to have that motion to have that question voted on at that time, subject to appeal. But again, you have all these other items that the full board could probably bring that out of a call for previous question. But again, that's something that you have all these other ones that we've talked about, and sometimes a motion will get stacked on other have other subsidiary motions underneath the motion to get to the place where the board ultimately wants to be. So that's the call for previous question, is to let's have a formal vote on the item that we're discussing at this time. Raise a question of privilege. This permits a question or motion to be brought up for a possible immediate consideration because of its urgency. So this is if somebody, and there's personal privilege as well as privileges for the whole board. So if somebody has personal privilege, so if there's a question of, I think I have it, if members have a matter involving comfort with regard to like heating, ventilation, lighting, noise, disturbance, conduct of officers or employees or visitors, then we would raise a question of privilege. That member would bring that to the attention of the board, interject, bring that to the attention of the board, say the power goes out, we need to do something. This would be the where you would raise a question of privilege. There's also a question of privilege as to if somebody during debate brings up something that is better left for executive session. It's something that should be discussed in executive session. If you start, talking about something that is an executive session matter at the table, then a person can interject and raise a question of privilege of the board. So executive session or those things that need to be maintained as confidential are board decisions. So one individual board member shouldn't be revealing confidential information or information that should be discussed in executive session. You shouldn't be revealing that in the board, and a board member can interject to say that should be better discussed in executive session, and there would be consideration of that. So number 3 on this page 18 provides you the guidebook as to how to bring one of these. I bring a question of privilege. I wish to raise a question of personal privilege if it's something relating to somebody's comfort. So that's how you would raise it. Depending on the context, determines whether it's should be seconded, debatable, or the board president simply hears the question and renders a decision. So if this is something immediate, the power goes out, we need to raise a question of privilege, or somebody needs to excuse themselves quickly, the board president can make a quick decision on it. If it's something where there needs to be consideration, if somebody's starting to bring stuff up that needs to be discussed in executive session, if you're talking about a sale of property, that's an item that can be discussed in executive session, and you start talking about, well, we're willing to offer this property for $1.2 million, and well, you don't want to reveal that information because somebody that's listening into your meeting could say, well, I know what they're willing to take as their offer. So you would interject to the board president and say, we have a motion, or this is a question of privilege. We should bring this into executive session. So those can be used at different times depending on what the discussion that's occurring. Motions to refer an item to committee generally are used to send a pending question to a small group of persons. So a committee. So you remember the motion to refer. This is a specific motion to refer it to a committee. If you have a standing committee, or if you want to create a committee to address a question. That would be the motion to refer to committee. This, again, is a motion that requires a second, is debatable, and requires a majority vote. So again, this is something that you would go through that whole motion process to determine whether you're going to refer something to the committee. Motions that are out of order. So this is motions that are not appropriate for consideration by the board. Motions where the action would conflict with the bylaws, board policy, procedural rules, applicable to the organization, or matters required by federal or state, local, if something is out of order, it's something where there's a violation of a bylaw, policy, state or federal law. Motions that propose action outside the scope of the organization's object as defined by the Constitution and bylaws. So even if you're going significantly off topic, that could be considered something that's out of order. Motions that present substantially the same question as a motion that was finally disposed of. So if we've already had an item in this meeting or a previous meeting, it's been discussed, it's been approved, whatever that is, bringing that topic or information up again is considered out of order. You would want to go back and say we want a motion to renew or motion to reconsider those things. If you want to bring up something previously that occurred, there's a mechanism for it. Use that mechanism. Don't just start talking about it or bringing it up. Unless accompanied by a motion to rescind or a motion to amend something previously adopted, no motion is in order that conflicts with a motion previously adopted at any time and still in force. So that's what that's referring to. No motion is in order that would conflict with or that presents substantially the same question, and that this is all types of things that would be considered out of order. And again, this is something that would be raised, and it would depend on the board president has the ability to call something out of order. That would be subject to appeal then if the board then finds that it wasn't out of order. So we would use that mechanism in place that we already talked about. The final few items about incidental motions, there's a motion to divide a question. This is when a motion has been proposed containing multiple parts and each of which is capable of standing as individual propositions. The parts can be separated to be considered and voted on as if they were distinct. So if somebody brings up a motion that's got several layers to it and the board decides we believe that this should be split into several questions, you would propose a motion to divide the question. Again, this is subject to debate, requires a majority vote, so and a second as well, so that it goes through the normal motion process. Motion to object to consideration enables a board to avoid a particular original main motion altogether when it believes it would be strongly undesirable for the motion to even come before the public body. So if you're having debate on something, you have a motion pending, and it seems like this isn't something we should even be addressing or dealing with at the time, you can object to consideration of that motion. It requires a 2/3 vote, and it's actually not subject to debate. So it's just something that gets proposed, seconded, and then it goes to vote of the board. The board then makes a decision, and it must be approved by 2/3 of the majority to pass that motion. Motion for parliamentary inquiry. This is where a parliamentary inquiry has been raised. If there's a question of how would Robert's Rules of Order address this question, an individual board member is allowed to raise that. It's an inquiry to the board president to answer those questions. The board president can consult with a parliamentarian, can consult to Robert's Rules of Order to make a decision on a motion for parliamentary inquiry. So this is, you've got something pending. There might be a question of parliamentary inquiry about is a 2/3 vote required on this, or is it only a majority vote? That's a parliamentary inquiry. So we would reference what we need to reference, whether that's pulling out Robert's rules, whether it's pulling out one of these appendices, whether it's looking at your board policy to determine how to answer that parliamentary question. The board president is not obligated to answer hypothetical questions. So we can't just be there, can't just stand here and say, how would Robert's Rules of Order deal with this if it's not something that is a question at hand or a question that's currently up to debate. A motion or question of parliamentary inquiry does not require a second, is not debatable, and does not require a vote of the board. This is within the hands of the board president to make that decision. Again, but if the board president makes a statement that may not align with Robert's Rules of Order, then we would, we'd go through the appeal process. Final item on motions is a motion for point or request of information. So this is different from a parliamentary inquiry. A motion for point of information is a request directed to the chair or through the board president to another officer or member for information relevant to the business at hand but not related to parliamentary procedure. Let's say you need to ask for financial information from CFO so you can make a decision. You can raise a motion for point or request for information. So to ask through the chair to the CFO, hey, what was our cost on that in the previous year? And if that information is available, then through the chair, the CFO would bring that information to the board. It doesn't require a second, is not debatable, and does not require a vote of the board. So this is a privilege motion that somebody can just raise without having to go through the whole motion process if that information is needed and helpful for the board.
Madam Chair, Mr. President, forgive me, I do not remember your name.
Jackson. Mark Jackson.
Mr. Jackson, if a board member is asking for information from our finance person or our superintendent, and that person is to bring that information and do not have the information at the time, of course, of the meeting, what would be a reasonable length of time? Is it at the next board meeting?
So it's also, do we want to proceed with voting on that motion at this time, or do we want to postpone it? So then we're going to go through the motion to postpone / motion to table to determine whether we're going to push that off to another meeting or if we're going to keep it later for this meeting. So if that information is not available, then the next question is, does that person that requested the point of information, does that person want to then submit another motion to say, I'd like to have a motion to table this or a motion to postpone this to the following meeting? Then you go through that process. And that's later in here. It's actually one of the next things we'll cover. I know we're at our initial 2-hour allotment, so this is also a logical place because we just finished motion. So if we want to stop for today, I'm open to that, and we can meet at our next scheduled meeting in April.
Yes. Thank you so much, Mr. Jackson. I think this information was very helpful and valuable, and I would say that we will pick it up from here at our next session, which is April the 11th.
That's correct, yep.
And so I would ask my colleagues if there are any other items that we would want to focus on, refer those to me so that maybe we can jump into those right away when we pick this back up. So again, I thank you. I appreciate you. And to the board members, we will be following up, making sure we get clarification around our policy, if it's silent or not, what the actual policy reads around the agenda, because there seemed to be a lot of inquiry around that. So thank you again. There is a need to recess into executive session for the following purpose: to consider the employment of a public employee or official under revised code 121.22 G1. We'll entertain a motion to recess into executive session.
I so move.
It has been moved by Member Perry. Is there a second?
Second.
It's been seconded by Dr. Molnar. Is there any discussion? Hearing and seeing none, roll call, please. Dr. Thompson.
Mr. Perry.
Yes.
Mrs. Sykes.
Yes.
Dr.
Yes.
Molnar.
Yes.
Mr. Alexander.
Yes.
Miss Autry.
Yes.
Miss Hall.
Yes.
Motion carries 6-0.
Thank you. It is 12:04. If you want to take a few minutes to stretch and use the restroom, we will reconvene in executive session. Are we going upstairs? Upstairs in 202. Thank you. Are we coming back down? Yes.